Welcome to this episode of Q&A with Liturgy Man. I'm Taylor Burton-Edwards, Liturgy Man, your Director of Worship Resources with Discipleship Ministries of the United Methodist Church. I am your apportionment dollars at work to help you strengthen worship and the understanding of worship where you are. Today I'm coming to you from Little Rock, Arkansas, where I'm spending the week with the Fellowship of United Methodists in Music and Worship Arts at their biennial convocation. And I want to answer a question that came to me through the UMC Worship Facebook group from Joanne Lesko Taylor, United Methodist pastor in New Ulm, Minnesota. The question is about altar tables, and specifically, why do we seem to have these very large altar table things often slammed up against the far wall in our worship spaces? What's the deal with all of that? Well, let me give you some background about 4 moments in the development of altar tables and tables for communion that have developed over the time since early Methodism to today. The first moment is actually 1662, which predates Methodism by a good bit, and that is the development of the rubrics about what the table is and how it is to be used in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. Because it is that set of rubrics and that ritual that John Wesley gave Methodists to use when we became an independent church in 1784. And that was the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, here's what that table was. It was a substantial table, but no longer an altar. Note that word. It was important because they were trying to make it clear that we are not being Roman Catholic here. We're not sacrificing at altars. We are praying at tables. And the height of it was slightly higher than what we might call today a coffee table. Because, again, to emphasize that idea of praying at altars, the presider would not typically be standing up in front of the table facing the wall, as it were, along with all the other people facing the wall, perhaps kneeling at the time. Rather, the presider was kneeling on the north end of the table, which to the left as you're looking at it from looking forward at it from the congregation. When Methodists began celebrating communion in what were now their own congregations, beginning after that Christmas conference in 1784, the tables they developed for their spaces were modeled on that Anglican model. They were low. They were smaller because Methodist worship spaces were generally smaller. And they would be up against the wall. Up against the wall, as had been the practice for Christians for a long time, because everyone faces east, with the exception of the presider, of course, when celebrating Holy Communion. We face east, face into the rising sun, face toward Jerusalem, face toward the resurrection. That's the idea of that orientation and that location. A second moment happened in the late 19th century as Methodists in this country, both North and South, were planting a lot of churches all over the place, and so starting new churches and needing new furniture for these new churches. And the fashion in church supply houses at that point, church furnishing houses, had shifted because of a sort of Anglo-Catholic revival in American Protestant tastes to providing what were gigantic altar tables, very substantial, sometimes made of stone, otherwise very large wooden altar kinds of tables, not just tables. And again, these still be against the east wall because everyone's facing east. And they'd be higher because Methodists by this time had pretty much given up the idea of kneeling a lot, because we were the only Protestants who were, and this we got a little bit of pushback from other Protestants at the time. So by the latter part of the 19th century, our presiders were likely standing facing away from the congregation, just like Roman Catholic priests would do and others would do, facing east at an altar table against that east wall. That brings us to the fourth moment of Vatican II. Vatican II in the Roman Catholic Church created a sea change in the whole nature of what was understood to be happening at the Lord's table for everybody, including Protestants, because we were recapturing Protestants and Catholics together, and Orthodox, recapturing the sense of what the early Christian church was doing through documents that were discovered, as well as through a recovery a lot of early Christian art depicting the way in which the Eucharistic sacrifice was offered. And in many of those cases, what we see is the presider standing behind the Lord's table, facing the congregation as if to prompt their praise and thanksgiving to God through the great thanksgiving, rather than standing in front of the table or the altar and offering this on behalf of the congregation. So we shifted back as Methodists, and our rubrics, beginning with the general services we adopted in '84, which were also included in the '88-'89 hymnal, and then put forward in greater detail in the 1992 Book of Worship, reflect the work of that scholarship and that sea change really kind of initiated by Vatican II, so that our presiders now stand, rather than kneel, stand behind a table rather than an altar, and therefore that needs to be pulled forward. Of course, many of our church buildings were built at a time when the supplies were these altar things that you put up against the back wall. So that's why in many of our places those are still there, though we call for a different practice now. Hope this has been helpful. Remember, you can always contact me, worship@umcdiscipleship.org, through our UMC Worship Facebook page, or just drop me a line on this page, and perhaps your question or comment will become the basis of a future episode of Q&A with Liturgy Man. May the peace of Christ be always with you.